The Skin Hunter Files. Detective Shernan investigates viewer discretion. Advised, this story contains descriptions of graphic violence, murder, and disturbing content that may be upsetting to some viewers. Intended for audiences 18 years and older. Legal disclaimer. The following is a dramatized account of real events. Names and certain details have been changed to protect identities. This content is presented for informational purposes only. Introduction. I've seen a lot in my 30 years as a detective, but nothing prepared me for the case I'm about to share with you. They call me Detective Shernan, and I specialize in cases that haunt the darkest corners of human depravity. Cases that remain unsolved, festering like open wounds on the face of justice. Cases that keep good men awake at night. February 2007, a quiet evening in eastern China. A routine dinner at a local restaurant that would spiral into one of the most disturbing serial murder cases I've ever encountered. The investigation would lead me down a rabbit hole of human depravity so profound it challenged my understanding of evil itself. What began with a simple piece of meat in a stew would unravel into a nightmare of skinned victims, ritualistic killings, and a mastermind so calculating that she nearly escaped detection by posing as one of her own victims. This is the story of the woman who hunted other women not for revenge, not for power, but for something far more primal. Beauty. The belief that by wearing their skin, she could preserve her youth forever. I've spent decades studying the criminal mind, but this case redefined what I thought humans were capable of. It's a story of manipulation so complete that even hardened killers became unwitting pawns in a game they didn't understand. As I walk you through this investigation, I want you to ask yourself, how well do you really know the people in your life? What lies beneath their skin? And most importantly, what would you do if you found yourself trapped in this nightmare? This is the case that changed everything. This is the Skin Hunter Files. The discovery. The night of February 17th, 2007 started like any other at Haidu Tavern in Guangjo, a bustling city in China's Guangdong Province. The tavern was known for its traditional herbal chicken stew, a local delicacy that brought in regular patrons from across the city. Among them that evening was a businessman named Mr. Davis Chin, 40, dining with colleagues. I remember reviewing the security footage later. You can see him laughing, enjoying the evening, completely unaware of the horror he was about to uncover. The first call came in around 8:45 p.m. I told my partner as we drove to the scene. Restaurant patron found something unusual in his food. Local police responded, but once they realized what they were dealing with, they called us in. When I arrived, the scene was already cordoned off. The tavern's once welcoming atmosphere had been replaced by the sterile, clinical presence of forensic technicians meticulously documenting everything. The restaurant manager was pale, visibly shaking as he recounted what had happened. Mr. Chin ordered our house special, the herbal chicken stew, he told me, his voice barely above a whisper. He was eating when suddenly he started screaming. What Mr. Chen had found was unmistakable, a human finger, complete with nail and visible fingerprint. Not a chicken bone, not an animal part, a human finger. I've seen a lot in my career, but standing there, staring at that severed digit floating in the broth, I felt a coldness creep into my bones that had nothing to do with the February chill. I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a simple case, I muttered to my partner as we examined the finger. Look at the clean cut. This wasn't accidental, and there's something else. On the second knuckle was a small, distinctive tattoo. The letter Z, a potential identifier, perhaps a clue to the victim's identity. But more importantly, it told me something about our perpetrator. They were either careless or wanted this to be found. As the restaurant staff huddled together in shock, I ordered a full examination of every dish served that evening. It didn't take long for our worst fears to be confirmed. The forensic team discovered more than just the finger. Several pieces of human tissue were mixed throughout the sauce, disguised by the rich flavors and textures of the stew. What kind of monster would do this? One of the younger officers whispered, turning away from the evidence bags. That's exactly what we need to find out, I replied, the gravity of what we were facing settling over the room. I've investigated murders where the killer wanted to hide their crimes. I've seen cases where they wanted to flaunt them. But this was something else entirely. This was someone turning their victims into food. As I stepped outside to call headquarters, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just scratched the surface of something profoundly disturbing. I didn't yet know about the 7 skinned victims, the love-struck accomplices, or the woman who orchestrated it all. I just knew that whoever had done this wasn't finished. If you were eating at a restaurant and discovered human remains in your food, I asked my partner as we prepared to expand our investigation, what would be your first thought? An accident? A sick joke? Or something far more sinister? Little did I know that within days, I'd be standing in a remote, abandoned building, staring at 7 skinned human faces and wondering if I was looking at the work of the most methodical killer I'd ever encountered. Following the supply chain, by dawn the next morning, our forensic team had confirmed what we already suspected. The chicken in Haidu Tavern's signature dish wasn't chicken at all. It was human flesh. The DNA results are preliminary, Dr. Mei Lin, our chief medical examiner, explained as she handed me the report. But there's no doubt. This is human tissue, and based on cellular degradation, I'd estimate it came from someone who died within the last 72 hours. I pinched the bridge of my nose, feeling the beginning of a migraine. We need to trace the supply chain, I told my team. Find out how human remains ended up in a restaurant dish served to dozens of people. My first stop was Haidu Tavern's kitchen. The staff were cooperating fully, still in shock from the previous night's events. The head chef, a man named Wei Bao, who'd been with the restaurant for 15 years, provided a crucial piece of information. The herbal chicken stew isn't prepared here, he explained, his hands trembling slightly. It comes from a food processing facility on the outskirts of the city. It's delivered daily, vacuum-sealed, and ready to heat. This wasn't unusual in Chinese restaurants, where some specialty dishes were outsourced to facilities with specific expertise. But it complicated our investigation significantly. Have you noticed anything unusual about recent deliveries? I asked. Any change in appearance, smell, texture? Wei shook his head. Nothing. It looked exactly the same as it always does. I dispatched half my team to the food processing facility while I continued examining the restaurant storage area. We sealed off every container of the pre-cooked stew and sent samples for immediate testing. The results were disturbing. It wasn't just the one portion served to Mr. Chen. multiple containers showed traces of human tissue, confirming this wasn't an isolated incident or a targeted attack. Someone had deliberately contaminated the entire batch. But why? My partner asked as we drove to the food processing facility. What does someone gain by putting human remains in food? That's what worries me, I replied, watching the industrial landscape pass by. Either we're dealing with someone who wants to create public panic, or what? Or someone who needed to dispose of a body and found a convenient way to do it. The food processing facility was located in an industrial zone about 20 miles from downtown Guangjo, a sprawling complex of stainless steel and concrete surrounded by loading docks and refrigerated trucks. As we approached with our search warrant, I noticed something odd. The facility appeared almost too perfect. No unusual smells, no signs of improper waste disposal, not even a hint of the chaos you'd expect in a place processing large quantities of meat. The manager, Anthony Kong, met us at the entrance, visibly nervous but cooperative. "This is impossible," he insisted as we explained why we were there. "We run a clean operation here. All our ingredients are sourced from certified suppliers." "We'll need to see your records," I told him, "every invoice, every delivery manifest, and we'll need to inspect your entire facility." What followed was one of the most thorough searches I've ever conducted. We examined every freezer, every preparation station, every cooking vessel. We reviewed hours of surveillance footage showing chicken being cleaned, deboned, marinated, and cooked. We interviewed every employee, from the executive chef to the delivery drivers, and we found nothing, absolutely nothing suspicious. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered as we regrouped outside. "The human flesh had to come from somewhere." That's when I decided to focus on the only remaining link in the chain: transportation. If the contamination didn't happen at the restaurant or the processing facility, it must have occurred during delivery. The driver responsible for transporting the stew from the facility to Haidu Tavern was a man named Lucas Wang, 35, with no criminal record and a decade of experience in food delivery. When we questioned him, he initially claimed nothing unusual had happened during his route. But as we pressed for details, he began to hesitate. "Mr. Wang," I said, leaning forward, "let me be clear. We're investigating a potential homicide. If you're withholding information, that makes you an accomplice." His composure cracked. I may have stopped for a bathroom break," he admitted. "There's an empty lot about 3 miles from the tavern. I was only gone for 10-15 minutes." "And the truck?" I asked, already knowing the answer. He looked down at his hands. "I left it unlocked. I thought I'd only be gone for a moment." It was the breakthrough we needed. If someone had been watching Lucas's route, waiting for the right moment, they could have easily accessed the cargo during those 15 minutes. "Take me to this empty lot," I told him. "Show me exactly where you stopped and what route you took." As we drove to the location, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were dealing with someone who knew the driver's route intimately. Someone who had planned this meticulously. Someone who wanted those remains to be found. What I didn't yet understand was why. What message was our killer trying to send? And more importantly, who was the victim whose finger had ended up in Mr. Chen's dinner? The answers, I would soon discover, were far more disturbing than I could have imagined. The surveillance footage. The empty lot where Lucas Wang had stopped his delivery truck was unremarkable, a patch of dirt and gravel surrounded by abandoned buildings. The kind of place that exists in the shadows of every major city. It wasn't on any tourist map of Guangjo, but it was about to become central to our investigation. "Show me exactly where you parked," I instructed Wang as we walked the perimeter. He pointed to a spot near the eastern edge. "Right there." I left the truck and went behind that building to use the bathroom. I surveyed the area, noting 2 security cameras mounted on an adjacent building. One pointed directly toward the spot where the truck would have been parked. "Those cameras," I said, pointing, "are they operational?" One of my officers approached the building owner, who confirmed they were. Within an hour, we had the footage. Back at headquarters, we gathered around a monitor to review it frame by frame. The video quality was poor, but clear enough to show Wang's truck pulling into the lot at 4:37 p.m. At 4:39, Wang exited the vehicle and disappeared behind a building. Then, at 4:42, something happened that sent a chill down my spine. A figure appeared from a narrow alley behind the lot. Tall, thin, wearing a worn gray jacket and a baseball cap pulled low. He approached the truck cautiously, constantly glancing around to ensure no one was watching. "Freeze it there," I instructed the technician. "Can you enhance that?" The image was grainy, but we could make out enough details to see the man carrying something a medium-sized bag that appeared to be heavy. He approached the back of the truck, crouched down, and spent approximately 5 minutes doing something we couldn't quite see from the camera angle. He knew exactly what he was doing, I observed. This wasn't opportunistic. He was waiting for Wang to stop. We ran the image through our facial recognition software, and within hours, we had a match. Kelvin Zhao, 43, a former chef at the very food processing facility that prepared the herbal chicken stew. His employment record showed he'd been fired a year earlier following multiple confrontations with co-workers. Notably, he had a documented altercation with Lucas Wang after Wang complained about delays in food preparation. "So we have motive," my partner said. "Revenge against Wang. Make it look like he contaminated the food." "Maybe," I replied, studying Zhao's file more closely. "But something doesn't add up. If revenge was the only motive, why use human remains? Why not something simpler, less traceable? And where did he get the body parts?" The questions multiplied as we dug deeper into Zhao's background. Since losing his job, he'd been living on the margins, bouncing between temporary accommodations, working odd jobs that never lasted long. And a week before our investigation began, he'd suddenly disappeared from his latest residence. "We need to find him," I told my team, "now." It took 3 days of canvassing, reviewing security footage, and following tips from informants before we got our break. A motel owner on the northern outskirts of Guangjo reported a guest matching Zhao's description, who rarely left his room during daylight hours and appeared to have a fresh wound on his arm. We moved quickly, surrounding the motel and positioning officers at every exit before making our approach. When we burst into room 117, we found Kelvin Zhao frantically stuffing clothes into a duffel bag, clearly preparing to flee. "Kelvin Zhao," I announced, my weapon drawn. "You're under arrest." He didn't resist, which surprised me. There was a resignation in his eyes, as if he'd been expecting us. At the station, Zhao initially denied everything, but when confronted with the surveillance footage, his demeanor changed. "I didn't kill anyone," he insisted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I only helped with after." "After what, Mr. Zhao?" I pressed, leaning across the table. "After someone was murdered? Who gave you the body parts? He refused to say, claiming he feared for his life. But he did give us one crucial piece of information. "There's an abandoned house," he finally said after hours of interrogation. "About 30 miles north of the city. That's where the bodies were processed." "Processed?" I repeated, the word sending a wave of nausea through me. "What exactly do you mean by processed?" He looked up, his eyes hollow. "You'll see when you get there. But be careful. She's still out there." "She?" I asked, suddenly alert. "Who is she?" But Zhao had said all he was going to say. He retreated into silence, refusing to answer any more questions. As we prepared to raid the abandoned house, one detail from Zhao's statement kept replaying in my mind. She's still out there? Until that moment, we had assumed we were looking for a male perpetrator. Now, we had to consider that a woman might be behind these horrific crimes. What we would find at the abandoned house would confirm that theory in the most gruesome way possible. The House of Horrors night had fallen by the time we reached the abandoned house, an old structure that had once been a small factory, now dilapidated and forgotten on the outskirts of Guangjo. Trees had grown up around it, nature reclaiming what humans had discarded. In the beam of our flashlights, it looked almost peaceful. But I've been a detective long enough to know that the most horrific crimes often occur in the most ordinary places. "Approach with extreme caution," I instructed the tactical team as they positioned themselves around the perimeter. "We don't know if the suspect is still inside." As we moved closer, I detected a faint odor, the unmistakable scent of death and decay, mingled with something chemical. It grew stronger with each step toward the structure. "Masks on," I ordered, pulling my own over my nose and mouth. Even through the filter, the stench was nearly overwhelming. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock. One of the officers moved forward with bolt cutters, and with a sharp snap, the lock fell away. The door swung open with an ominous creak, revealing absolute darkness inside. "Police! Anyone inside, show yourself now!" my partner shouted as we entered, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. No response came. The building was silent, except for the echo of our footsteps on the concrete floor. What our lights revealed next is something that will stay with me until the day I die. Large patches of dried blood stained the concrete, some areas showing signs of having been scrubbed, but the porous surface had held on to the evidence. Blood spatter analysis would later confirm that multiple violent acts had taken place here over an extended period. In the center of the main room stood a wooden table, its surface deeply scarred with knife marks. Beneath it lay several plastic bags containing small bone fragments and tissue samples, evidence that someone had been systematically dismembering bodies here. But it was what we found in the large metal barrel that truly revealed the horror of what we were dealing with. 7 human heads, all of them completely skinned, no faces, no identifiable features, just bare skull with patches of hair, the neck cleanly severed by what our medical examiner would later determine was a surgical-grade instrument. "My God," whispered one of the younger officers, turning away. Even the veterans among us were visibly shaken. "I've investigated hundreds of homicides in my career. I've seen bodies mutilated by rage, by psychosis, by the darkest impulses humans can harbor. But this was different. This was methodical, precise, almost clinical. This wasn't done out of anger," I said as I carefully examined the scene. "This was done with purpose." Beside the barrel of heads, we found a second container filled with bone ash, evidence that parts of the bodies had been burned to destroy evidence. Under a plastic tarp nearby, we discovered scattered human remains, a mummified hand, sawed-off limbs, bone fragments mixed with ash. Next to all this sat a large cooking pot containing a herbal soup nearly identical to the stew served at Haidu Tavern. The implications were clear and horrifying. This was where Kelvin Zhao had obtained the human flesh he planted in the food delivery. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a small adjoining room, we found what could only be described as a shrine. Photographs of young women were pinned to the wall, their faces circled in red marker. Beneath each photo were notes written in meticulous handwriting details about their routines, where they worked, what routes they took home. They were hunting logs. Among them, I recognized one face immediately. A young woman reported missing just 4 days before our investigation began. Lily Zhang, 21 years old, a university student. The tattoo on her finger, a small Z for Zhang, matched the one on the finger found in the stew. She's been targeting them, I realized aloud, selecting them. But why? What is she doing with their faces? The answer to that question would lead us to understand a level of depravity I hadn't thought possible. As we secured the scene and began the painstaking process of collecting evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. 7 skinned heads meant 7 victims, but we'd only been able to identify one. Who were the others? And more importantly, where were the rest of their remains? The abandoned house had given us answers, but it had also raised new disturbing questions. Questions that would lead us to uncover not just a killer, but an entire operation built around death, deception, and a twisted obsession with beauty. If you were investigating this case, I asked my team as we prepared to expand our search, what would disturb you more, the act of killing or the methodical harvesting of human faces? What kind of person would want to collect facial skin, and why? The answers, when they finally came, would be more disturbing than any of us could have imagined. The missing women. Following the discovery at the abandoned house, our investigation shifted focus to identifying the victims and understanding the motive behind such calculated brutality. We began by cross-referencing recent missing persons reports in and around Guangjo, focusing particularly on young women between the ages of 18 and 25. 10 women matching our criteria have been reported missing. In the past 2 months, Officer Lin reported, laying out photographs on the conference room table. All of them disappeared within a 20-mile radius of the city. I studied each face, wondering how many of them corresponded to the 7 skinned heads we'd discovered. Do any of them have distinctive markings? Tattoos, scars, anything that might help with identification? Officer Lin nodded, pulling out one photograph. Lily Zhang, the 21-year-old we've already linked to the finger found in the stew. Her family confirmed she had a small Z tattoo on her finger. At least we had confirmed one victim. But what about the others? Just then, my phone rang. It was the forensics lab. Detective Shernan, the technician said, her voice tense. We've completed preliminary DNA analysis of the tissue samples from the abandoned house. There's something you need to know. Go ahead, I replied, putting her on speaker so the team could hear. We've identified 3 distinct DNA profiles in the human tissue. This confirms that at least 3 separate victims had their remains mixed into the food. 3 DNA profiles, but 7 skinned heads. Something wasn't adding up. Is it possible the other victims were killed longer ago? I asked. Could the DNA have degraded? Possibly, she conceded. But there's something else. We found traces of a chemical preservative on the skinned heads, similar to what taxidermists use. Someone was trying to preserve the removed facial skin. The implication sent a chill through the room. This wasn't just about murder or even disposing of bodies. Someone was keeping the faces. As we processed this disturbing information, another officer burst into the room. Detective, we just received a new missing persons report. 2 young women disappeared 3 days ago. Michelle Wang, 20, and Emily Lin, 19. They were last seen walking past Haidu Tavern. This was too much of a coincidence to ignore. I immediately dispatched officers to collect DNA samples from both families and requested a comparison with our unidentified samples. The results came back within hours, confirming our worst fears. One of the DNA profiles matched Michelle Wang, meaning she was among the victims whose remains had been found in the stew. But Emily Lin's DNA didn't match any of our samples, which meant one of 2 things. Either she wasn't among the victims we'd discovered, or she could still be alive, I said, voicing the thought that had occurred to all of us. If Lin wasn't killed and processed with the others, there's a chance she's being held somewhere. This realization injected new urgency into our investigation. If Emily Lin was still alive, we had a responsibility to find her before she met the same fate as the others. I ordered an immediate review of all surveillance footage from the area around Haidu Tavern, focusing on the night the 2 young women disappeared. Hours of combing through grainy video finally yielded a crucial piece of evidence. There, Officer Lin pointed to the screen. 10:04 p.m., Wong and Lin walking north about a block from the tavern. We watched as the 2 women moved down the sidewalk, apparently engaged in conversation. Minutes later, a black minivan appeared in the frame, traveling slowly behind them. Keep watching, I instructed, leaning closer to the screen. Suddenly, the van stopped. 2 figures in dark clothing emerged, approaching the women from behind. The attack was swift and coordinated within seconds. Both women had been subdued and forced into the vehicle. The entire abduction took less than a minute. "Freeze it there," I ordered as the van began to pull away. "Can you enhance the license plate?" The technician worked his magic, but the plate had been deliberately obscured. However, we did notice something else, a distinctive long scratch on the van's right door and a partially peeled decal revealing white paint underneath. It wasn't much, but it was something. I immediately ordered a search for all black minivans with similar damage registered in the area. As this search was underway, we returned to questioning Kelvin Zhao, hoping that the new evidence might convince him to reveal more about the operation. When confronted with the footage of the abduction, his complexion paled visibly. "Do you recognize that van, Mr. Zhao?" I asked, watching his reaction carefully. He looked away, refusing to meet my eyes. I can't tell you. Emily Lin might still be alive," I pressed. "If you know where she is, you have a moral obligation to tell us." Something in his expression shifted a flicker of what might have been remorse. "The van belongs to a man named Victor Song. He's the one who delivers them." "Delivers them to whom?" Zhao fell silent again, but he'd already given us the lead we needed. Victor Song, 46, had a criminal record that included kidnapping and human trafficking. He'd served 5 years in prison, but had fallen off the radar after his release. With this new information, we intensified our search. Song's last known address was vacant, but property records showed he owned a small house in a secluded suburban area outside the city. Time was running out for Emily Lynn. If she was still alive, every minute counted. I assembled a tactical team, and we prepared to raid Song's property, hoping we weren't already too late. The question that haunted me as we approached the house was not just whether we would find Emily Lynn alive, but what kind of person was orchestrating this elaborate operation of abduction, murder, and facial mutilation, and why. The answers would prove more disturbing than anything I could have imagined. The missing link, the raid on Victor Song's house, began at dawn. Tactical teams surrounded the property, while snipers took positions with clear sight lines to all entrances. The house itself was unremarkable, a small single-story structure set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown vegetation that provided natural concealment. On my mark, I instructed over the radio as we prepared to breach. Remember, we have reason to believe there may be a hostage inside. Protect any civilians. The front door was locked from the inside, forcing us to use a battering ram. As it splintered open, the stench that greeted us was unmistakable, the sweet, sour smell of decomposition. In the living room, we found the body of a woman. She lay face down on the floor, hands and feet bound with zip ties. Her body showed signs of severe abuse bruises, lacerations, and evidence of prolonged starvation. When we carefully turned her over, I had to fight to maintain my professional composure. Her face had been completely removed, not just superficially cut, but methodically skinned down to the bone, just like the heads we'd found in the abandoned house. Check for ID, I instructed one of the officers, though I already suspected who this was. No wallet, no identification, he reported back. But based on the physical description and clothing, this appears to be Emily Lynn. DNA testing would later confirm this, but I knew we were too late to save her. However, the house still needed to be thoroughly searched. As officers moved through the rooms, one called out from the bedroom, "Detective, in here!" I rushed to join him and found him standing before a large wardrobe. "I heard something inside," he explained. Drawing my weapon, I approached cautiously. "This is the police. If someone's in there, come out slowly with your hands visible." No response came, but I could hear faint breathing. I nodded to the officer, who prepared to open the door while I covered him. As the wardrobe door swung open, we were met with a sight that sent a surge of adrenaline through me. A young woman was bound inside, her mouth sealed with duct tape, eyes wide with terror. She was alive. "Get the paramedics in here now!" I shouted, holstering my weapon and carefully removing the tape from her mouth. "Please," she gasped, trembling violently, "please get me out of here." As the paramedics rushed her to an ambulance, I noticed something odd. Despite claiming she'd been held captive, she didn't show the same signs of physical deterioration as Emily Lynn. No indications of prolonged starvation or abuse. Her clothes were dirty, but relatively intact. But perhaps the strangest detail was her apparent calm once the initial shock wore off. There was something almost rehearsed about her demeanor. At the hospital, we confirmed her identity, Diana Yu, a 22-year-old university student. When asked why no missing persons report had been filed, she explained that she lived independently and had no family in the area. "I was kidnapped walking home from classes," she told me, her voice steady. "I never saw who took me. I was kept in that wardrobe the whole time." Something about her story didn't add up. If she'd been confined to the wardrobe for days or weeks, she should have shown more severe signs of physical deterioration. And how had she managed to stay hydrated? When I pressed her on these inconsistencies, she simply repeated, "I heard things I wasn't supposed to hear." While we had no evidence to detain her, I instructed officers to maintain surveillance after her release from the hospital. Something about Diana Yu didn't feel right, but I couldn't yet articulate what it was. Meanwhile, our search for Victor Song intensified. His house had yielded Emily Lin's body and a living witness, but no sign of Song himself. 3 days after Diana Yu's release, we received a report from a gas station attendant about an abandoned black minivan. When officers arrived, they found Victor Song slumped over the steering wheel, a deep wound across his throat. A bloody knife lay on the dashboard, suggesting suicide. But just as with Diana Yu's story, certain details didn't align. The wound on Song's neck wasn't consistent with a self-inflicted injury. It was too precise, made with a strength and angle that would have been difficult to achieve on oneself. Most tellingly, strands of long black hair were found in the vehicle hair that DNA testing would later confirm belonged to Diana Yu. "She was in that van," I told my partner as we processed the scene. "She wasn't just a victim. She was there when Song died." The timing was too convenient to ignore. Song had been killed just hours after Diana Yu was released from police protection, and the mini refrigerator that had been installed in Song's van was missing, though the power cables remained. "We need to search Diana Yu's residence immediately," I ordered. "I believe we've been looking at this all wrong." The search warrant was executed that evening. What we found inside her apartment confirmed my worst suspicions. Hidden in her freezer, wrapped carefully in cloth, was a preserved human face, the facial skin of Emily Lin, treated with the same chemical preservative found on the skinned heads at the abandoned house. In her bedroom, we discovered handwritten journals filled with references to ancient beauty rituals, detailed drawings of facial anatomy, and notes on preservation techniques. One passage stood out. "The essence of youth lies beneath the surface. When worn, it becomes mine. Their beauty becomes my beauty. Their youth becomes my youth." Diana Yu wasn't a victim. She was the architect behind everything: the abductions, the murders, the preservation of facial skin, and the disposal of bodies. When officers moved to arrest her as she returned home, she initially maintained her act of innocence. But when confronted with the overwhelming evidence and brought face to face with Kelvin Zhao, her composure finally broke. The truth that emerged was more disturbing than anything we could have anticipated. A deeply disturbed young woman obsessed with an ancient belief that wearing the facial skin of others could transfer their youth and beauty to her. But she hadn't acted alone. She had manipulated 2 men into helping her Victor Song, a career criminal who had become infatuated with her, and Kelvin Zhao, a volatile but ultimately naive man who believed he was protecting her from Song. The case that began with a finger in a bowl of stew had led us to a killer whose methods redefined cruelty and whose motivations challenged our understanding of human depravity. As we prepared for trial, I couldn't help but wonder, what would you do if you discovered someone close to you was capable of such calculated evil? Would you recognize the monster behind the mask? Or would you, like Zhao and Song, be manipulated into becoming an unwitting accomplice? The Manipulation Master. The interrogation room felt unusually cold the day Diana Yu finally confessed. I'd been in this same room hundreds of times, faced countless killers, but something about her presence sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. She sat perfectly poised, hands folded neatly on the metal table, her posture relaxed despite the handcuffs binding her wrists. What struck me most wasn't her appearance. She was ordinary in almost every way, but the absolute emptiness in her eyes. Not rage, not fear, not even the usual defiance I'd seen in other killers, just nothing. "Let's start at the beginning," I said, opening the case file. "How did all this start?" For a moment she remained silent, studying me with an unsettling intensity. Then, without warning, her entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes welled with tears, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I was so scared," she whispered. "Victor forced me to help him. He said he would kill me if I didn't." It was a masterful performance, one I might have believed if I hadn't already uncovered the truth. This was what made Diana Yu truly dangerous. She could transform herself instantly, becoming whatever she needed to be to manipulate those around her. I slid the journal we'd found in her apartment across the table. "Then how do you explain this? Your handwriting, your plans, your obsession with wearing other women's faces?" The tears vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Her expression hardened, and I caught a glimpse of something predatory behind her eyes. "You don't understand," she said, her voice now cold and controlled. "Beauty is power. Youth is currency. I found a way to take both." What followed was one of the most disturbing confessions I've encountered in my 3 decades as a detective. Diana Yu believed in an ancient ritual that claimed the essence of youth and beauty could be transferred through skin, not metaphorically, but literally, by removing another person's facial skin and applying it to one's own face. "When did you start?" I asked, struggling to keep my professional composure. 3 years ago," she replied with chilling casualness. "The first was an accident. I was experimenting. But the feeling was transcendent." She described how she had initially worked alone, luring victims to isolated locations. But as her operation expanded, she realized she needed help people who could assist with abductions and disposal without asking too many questions. That's when she began her most insidious work, the manipulation of 2 men who would become her unwitting accomplices. Victor Song had been her neighbor years earlier. After his release from prison, they reconnected by what she described as fortunate coincidence, though I suspected there was nothing coincidental about it. "He was always interested in me," she explained with a slight smile. "Men like Victor are so easy to control. A touch here, a promise there. I told him I needed special ingredients for my beauty treatments. He didn't ask questions. Kelvin Zhao was different. He wasn't inherently criminal like Song. He was rough-edged, quick-tempered, but not evil. Diana had once helped him after an injury, a calculated act of kindness designed to create a sense of obligation. Kelvin was loyal," she continued, "too loyal. When I convinced him that Victor was holding me captive, he would have done anything to protect me. She had created an elaborate fiction, positioning herself as a victim caught between 2 men, one who threatened her Victor and one who protected her Kelvin. Neither realized they were both being manipulated by the true predator. The perfect system," she said with unmistakable pride. "Victor brought them to me. Kelvin disposed of what was left, and neither knew the full truth. But the system began to unravel when Kelvin accidentally witnessed Diana removing a victim's face. He realized she wasn't being forced by Victor, she was the mastermind. He became difficult after that, she said, her expression darkening. Started making mistakes, leaving evidence. I think he wanted to get caught, but he couldn't bring himself to turn me in. Love is such a useful weakness. When police began investigating, Diana executed the next phase of her plan. She staged her own kidnapping, positioning herself as just another victim. She killed Victor, making it look like suicide, then placed herself in the wardrobe where we would find her the rescued victim who could manipulate the narrative from within. If it weren't for the hair samples in Victor's van, I noted, you might have succeeded. Details, she shrugged. Everyone makes mistakes eventually. As the confession continued, one question continued to nag at me. Why mix the remains into restaurant food? Why take that risk? Her answer was as practical as it was disturbing. Bodies leave evidence. Turn them into food, and they literally disappear inside other people. The perfect disposal method. When we finally charged Diana Yu, the case had expanded to include 7 confirmed murders, 2 accomplices, 1 deceased, 1 facing life imprisonment, and a level of premeditation rarely seen in criminal investigations. The trial that followed became a national sensation. Criminal psychologists studied her methods. Law enforcement agencies updated their training, and the public struggled to comprehend how someone so young could harbor such calculated evil. Diana Yu was sentenced to death, while Kelvin Zhao received life imprisonment without possibility of parole. As I packed away the case files, I couldn't help but reflect on how easily she had manipulated everyone around her, Kelvin, Victor, even the police initially. She had created an elaborate fiction and cast herself in the role of victim so convincingly that she nearly escaped justice. The most frightening aspect wasn't the murders themselves, horrific as they were. It was her ability to identify weaknesses in others and exploit them without remorse. Love, loyalty, compassion. She saw these not as human virtues, but as vulnerabilities to be manipulated. How many Diana Yus walk among us, wearing masks of normalcy while harboring unthinkable secrets? How would you recognize such a person in your own life before it's too late? The case of the skin hunter forced me to reconsider everything I thought I knew about human nature and the depths to which some will sink in pursuit of their darkest obsessions. The moral of darkness. The Diana Yu case closed officially on June 12, 2008, when she was executed for her crimes. Kelvin Zhao remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. The 7 victims were finally laid to rest by their families, though the trauma of how they died continues to haunt their loved ones. As for me, I've investigated hundreds of cases since then, but this one stays with me like no other, not just because of the gruesome nature of the crimes, but because of what it revealed about human nature, both its darkest depths and its surprising resilience. I visited Kelvin Zhao in prison 6 months after the trial concluded. He'd lost weight, and the volatile temper that had once defined him seemed to have burned out completely. "Why did you want to see me?" he asked as we sat across from each other in the visitors area. "I'm trying to understand," I replied honestly, "how someone like Diana was able to manipulate you so completely." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his hands. "Have you ever loved someone so much that you would do anything for them?" he finally asked. Even things that go against everything you believe? I'd like to think there are lines I wouldn't cross, I told him. Everyone says that, he replied, until they find themselves crossing those lines one by one, each step seeming smaller than the last. His words have stayed with me. The truth is, Diana Yu didn't turn ordinary men into monsters overnight. She led them down a path of incremental moral compromises, each small enough to rationalize, until they found themselves complicit in horrors they could never have imagined. It's easy to believe we would recognize evil when we see it, that we would stand firm against manipulation, that our moral compass would never fail us. But the reality is far more complicated. Evil often doesn't announce itself. It doesn't appear as a monster wearing a sign. Instead, it seduces. It rationalizes. It appeals to our deepest desires and insecurities. It makes us feel special, needed, understood, and by the time we recognize it for what it is, we may already be entangled beyond escape. The most chilling aspect of this case wasn't just what Diana Yu did to her victims, but how she used human connection, our fundamental need to be loved and valued, as a weapon. She identified what each person in her orbit needed most, then provided just enough of it to secure their loyalty and compliance. If you're watching this and thinking, "This could never happen to me," I urge you to reconsider. The most dangerous predators don't target the weak. They target those who believe they are too strong, too smart, or too moral to be manipulated. The real moral of this case isn't simply that monsters exist among us. It's that the line between ordinary people and those who commit unspeakable acts is thinner than we like to believe. It's about recognizing that none of us is immune to manipulation, especially when it comes disguised as love, acceptance, or understanding. Ask yourself, what compromises would you make for someone you deeply cared about? Where would you draw the line? And most importantly, would you recognize when your moral boundaries were being systematically dismantled? Diana Yu didn't just take the lives and faces of 7 young women. She stole the humanity of those she manipulated into helping her. She understood that you don't need to kill someone to destroy them. Sometimes you just need to make them complicit in your darkness. So I leave you with this. Pay attention to the incremental compromises you make, especially those justified by love or loyalty. Notice when someone consistently positions themselves as a victim while demanding increasingly troubling actions from you. And remember that true love never requires you to violate your deepest moral principles. The greatest protection against the Diana Yus of the world isn't suspicion or paranoia. It's self-awareness and an unwavering commitment to your own moral boundaries. If this case has affected you, please share it with those you care about. Not to frighten them, but to help them recognize the subtle ways manipulation can take root before it blooms into something deadly. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the darkest cases I've ever investigated. If you found value in this exploration, please subscribe to my channel for more insights from my decades working unsolved and extraordinary cases. And if you know someone who might benefit from these lessons, share this video with them. Remember, the monsters aren't always hiding under the bed. Sometimes they're sitting across the dinner table, wearing the most convincing disguise of all, a human face. Until next time, this is Detective Shernan, reminding you that in the darkest cases, we often find the most important truths about ourselves.